Case 1, October 12th, 1964. The $650 French silk gown hit the marble floor of Bergmann Sterling with a whisper, the kind of sound that shouldn't matter, but in that moment, it was the loudest thing on Fifth Avenue. May Johnson's hand tightened on her daughter's arm, not out of fear, out of control, because May Johnson knew that if she let go, if she allowed herself to react the way every fiber of her being screamed to react, she would become exactly what this man wanted her to be. The man's name was Charles Whitfield Petton III, and for the past 5 minutes, he had been performing what witnesses would later describe as a public desecration. He stood there in his custom-tailored charcoal suit, his face red with a rage that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his ancestry, and he used language so vile that the other customers, all white, all wealthy, all silent, physically recoiled. But they didn't leave, and they didn't intervene. They just watched. What this wealthy real estate mogul didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known as he stood there in the cathedral-like interior of Manhattan's most exclusive boutique, was that he'd just declared war on the most powerful man in Harlem, and he had exactly 72 hours left before his entire $45 million empire would collapse around him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind to the moment Mayme and Ruthie Johnson walked through those doors. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Monday afternoon. The autumn light filtered through Bergmann Sterling's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in that golden glow that made Fifth Avenue feel like a different country. Because in 1964, it was. May Johnson was 52 years old, now impeccably dressed in a navy Dior suit that she'd purchased in Paris the year before. Her daughter, Ruthie, 29, Barnard-educated, fluent in French, wore a cream-colored dress that cost more than most Harlem families made in a month. They weren't just well-dressed, they were a statement. The Civil Rights Act had been signed into law exactly 102 days earlier. On paper, stores like Bergmann Sterling could no longer bar black patrons. On paper, America had changed. But paper doesn't mean much when you're standing in a room full of people who wish you didn't exist. The sales clerk, a young woman named Patricia, no more than 23, had been helping them for about 20 minutes. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she showed them the new collection from Paris. Not because she was prejudiced, but because she could feel the temperature in the room dropping with every passing minute. The other customers had stopped shopping. They were watching. Some pretended to examine scarves they had no intention of buying. Others simply stared, their faces frozen in that particular expression of discomfort that white liberals wore when confronted with the reality of integration. And then Charles Petton walked in. He was there to pick up 3 custom suits, $800 worth of tailoring that had taken 6 weeks to complete. He was a regular customer, the kind of man the staff knew by name, whose preferences were memorized, whose arrival was treated like a minor royal visit. He saw Patricia helping May and Ruthie, and something in him snapped. Witnesses would later disagree on exactly what he said first, but they all agreed on the tone. It was the tone of a man who believed he had the right to say anything to anyone without consequence. He approached the counter where the French silk gown, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, hand-stitched in lion, was being wrapped. He looked at Patricia with genuine confusion, as if he'd walked into his home and found strangers rearranging the furniture. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he asked her. Patricia froze. I'm helping these customers, Mr. Petton." "Customers?" He said the word like it was a foreign concept. Then he turned to look at May and Ruthie for the first time. Really look at them, and what came out of his mouth next would cost him everything. For the next 5 to 7 minutes, witnesses varied on the exact duration. That's but all agreed. It felt like an eternity. Charles Petton unleashed a tirade that went beyond simple prejudice. He used words like contamination. He spoke about hygiene and standards, and the kind of people who were ruining establishments like Bergmann and Sterling. He didn't just use offensive language. He used the vocabulary of dehumanization, the same language that had been used to justify every atrocity in American history. And then, as if the words weren't enough, he reached for the gown. He grabbed it from Patricia's hands, this delicate piece of art that had traveled across an ocean, and he threw it on the floor, not dropped it, threw it, like it was contaminated, like it was garbage. "I will not," he said, his voice rising, "stand here and watch this store debase itself." May Johnson didn't move, didn't speak. Her face remained perfectly composed, a mask of dignity that must have taken every ounce of strength she possessed, because May Johnson knew something that Charles Petton didn't. She knew that in Harlem, about 40 blocks north, her husband was sitting in his office above the Palm Cafe. And when she told him what happened here today, the world as Charles Petton knew it would end. Ruthie's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. Not there, not in front of these people. She was 29 years old, part of the generation that was supposed to be free. And here she was in the most expensive zip code in America, being treated like a trespasser in her own country. Patricia, the sales clerk, stood there with her hands shaking, looking between Peyton and the Johnsons, clearly wanting to help, but terrified of losing her job. And the other customers? They shifted uncomfortably. One woman, her name was Margaret Holbrook, and this detail will matter later, looked like she wanted to say something. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked down at the handbag she was holding, and she said nothing. The silence of good people, it turns out, sounds exactly like approval. Finally, the store manager emerged from the back. His name was Mr. Carmichael, and he'd been managing Bergmann and Sterling for 17 years. He'd never had to deal with anything like this. The Civil Rights Act was supposed to make things easier, not harder. It was supposed to be simple, serve everyone, treat everyone equally, and everything would be fine. But nobody had told him what to do when one of your best customers was having a public meltdown because you were serving black women. "Mr. Petton," he said carefully, "fear perhaps we should—" "Don't you dare tell me what I should do." Petton snapped. "I've been a customer here for 30 years. 30 years. My father shopped here. My grandfather shopped here. And now you're going to stand there and tell me that I have to share this space with—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. May Johnson finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, controlled, and carried the weight of every indignity she'd ever swallowed. "We'll take the gown," she said to Patricia, "and the 2 evening dresses we selected. Please have them delivered to our home in Harlem." She said Harlem deliberately, clearly. She wanted everyone in that store to hear it. Then she took Ruthie's hand, and they walked toward the door, their heads high, their dignity intact, while leaving behind a room full of people who would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they'd witnessed. Charles Petton stood there, breathing hard, looking around at the other customers as if expecting applause. What he got instead was uncomfortable silence. Even the people who agreed with him, and there were several, knew that what had just happened was too ugly to celebrate out loud. Mr. Carmichael picked up the silk gown from the floor. It wasn't damaged, but somehow it felt ruined anyway. Outside, Mayme and Ruthie Johnson climbed into a taxi. The driver, a black man in his 50s, saw their faces and didn't ask questions. He just drove north, toward 125th Street, toward Harlem, toward home, toward the office above the Palm Cafe. That's where Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, was about to receive news that would ignite a 72-hour war unlike anything Fifth Avenue had ever seen. Before we go further, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. This story happened in New York, but what happened next would send shockwaves that proved one thing. In 1964, dignity had enforcers, and Charles Peyton was about to meet the most powerful one in America. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the world Mayme and Ruthie Johnson walked back into that October afternoon. New York City in 1964 was two cities occupying the same space. The Civil Rights Act had been signed on July 2nd, just 102 days before the Bergmann and Sterling incident. President Lyndon B. Johnson had put pen to paper and declared that segregation was over. But laws don't change hearts, and they certainly don't change Fifth Avenue overnight. The white backlash was in full effect. While the law said stores couldn't bar black customers, the informal policies remained perfectly intact. Follow them through the aisles, provide slow service, make them feel unwelcome without ever saying the quiet part out loud. Fifth Avenue wasn't just a shopping district, it was a fortress, the last stronghold of WASP America, where old money went to pretend the world outside wasn't changing. And then there was Charles Whitfield Peyton III, third-generation wealth. His grandfather's shipping fortune had been built in the 1880s on the backs of labor he would never acknowledge. By 1964, Charles had transformed that inheritance into a $45 million real estate empire that stretched across Manhattan's Upper West Side. But his real fortune wasn't in the buildings. It was in the invisible architecture of exclusion. Peyton was a master of redlining, of restrictive covenants, of the gentlemen's agreements that kept Manhattan segregated without a single law on the books. He sat on the boards of the Knickerbocker Club and the Union Club, where men like him made decisions over cigars and brandy about who belonged in their city and who didn't. The Civil Rights Act wasn't just legislation to Charles Peyton. It was a personal insult, an invasion, a contamination of everything his family had spent 3 generations building. But here's what Peyton didn't know as he stood in Bergmann and Sterling, drunk on his own righteousness. May Johnson wasn't just any woman. She was educated, worldly, fluent in French. Etienne had traveled to Paris more times than most of Peyton's country club friends. She represented the new Negro of the 1960s, the generation that refused to accept second-class citizenship. And Ruthie? At 29, she was supposed to be free. She'd grown up being told that if she worked hard, if she was twice as good, if she carried herself with dignity, America would finally accept her. That afternoon at Bergmann and Sterling shattered that illusion in 5 brutal minutes. But the most important thing Charles Peyton didn't know, the detail that would cost him everything, was whose family he'd just humiliated. Because 40 blocks north, in an office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street, sat a man who'd spent the last year rebuilding an empire of his own. A man who controlled more liquid cash than most of Peyton's leveraged real estate holdings. A man who understood that in America, power wasn't just about what you owned. It was about what you could take away. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but everyone in Harlem called him Bumpy. and he was about to teach Charles Peyton the most expensive lesson of his life. The taxi pulled up to 125th Street just after 3:30 p.m. The moment May and Ruthie crossed from Fifth Avenue into Harlem, the atmosphere changed. The cold, hostile silence of downtown Manhattan gave way to something warmer. The sounds of street vendors, jazz drifting from open doorways, neighbors calling to each other from stoops. This was home. This was safety. But for May Johnson, there was no safety in what she had to do next. She had to tell her husband what happened. The office above the Palm Cafe was modest by Fifth Avenue standards, but it was the nerve center of Black Harlem's underground economy. This is where Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson conducted the business that made him the most powerful man north of 110th Street. When May walked through that door, Bumpy was reviewing ledgers with two of his associates. He looked up, saw his wife's face, and immediately dismissed everyone from the room. "What happened?" he asked quietly. May Johnson had spent the last 45 minutes holding herself together. Now, in the presence of the one man she didn't have to perform for, the dam broke. Not with tears. May Johnson didn't cry easily, but with a cold, precise recounting of every word, every gesture, every humiliation. Bumpy listened in silence. His face didn't change. He didn't interrupt. But those who knew him well would have recognized the signs. The way his jaw tightened, the way his hands went completely still, the way his eyes seemed to look through the walls toward some distant target. When May finished, Bumpy asked only one question. "His name?" "Charles Whitfield Patton III, May said. "He's a real estate developer, Upper West Side." Bumpy nodded slowly. Then he picked up the phone. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was, and more importantly, what he wasn't. He wasn't a hothead. He wasn't a street thug who solved problems with violence. By 1964, Bumpy Johnson was 57 years old, a man who'd spent years in Alcatraz and returned to Harlem in 1963 with a reputation that preceded him like thunder. He was a poet who quoted Shakespeare, a chess player who thought 5 moves ahead, a philanthropist who quietly funded scholarships for Harlem kids. But he was also a man who'd built an empire on the numbers racket, the illegal lottery that generated millions in cash every year. While men like Charles Peyton were asset-rich but cash-poor, leveraged to their eyeballs in bank loans, Bumpy Johnson had something more valuable: liquid capital, money that didn't require a bank's permission, money that could move fast, and he was a man on parole, which meant that the old solutions, the violent solutions, were off the table. One wrong move and he'd be back in a cell. So as he sat in that office making phone calls in a voice that never rose above conversational, Bumpy Johnson made a calculated decision. He wouldn't kill Charles Peyton. That would be too quick, too merciful, and far too risky. Instead, he would do something worse. He would use Peyton's own god against him: money. Within an hour, the 2 men arrived at the Palm Cafe. Theodore Green, a sharply dressed attorney who moved between Harlem streets and Manhattan suites with equal ease, and a man everyone called Bub Hewlett, muscle with a brain, the kind of enforcer who understood that real power was about leverage, not violence. Bumpy looked at both men and said 5 words that would launch a 72-hour war. "I need to ruin someone." The budget? $75,000, all cash, no questions asked. The target? A $45 million real estate empire. The timeline? 3 days. Charles Peyton had humiliated Bumpy Johnson's family on a Monday afternoon. By Thursday morning, Petton would be begging for mercy. What time is it where you are right now? Because for Charles Petton, time just ran out. And hit that like button if you want to see how Bumpy dismantled a $45 million empire in just 72 hours, using nothing but phone calls, cash, and the one thing Petton never saw coming: his own greed. Monday night, October 12th, 1964. While Charles Petton slept soundly in his Upper East Side townhouse, completely unaware that he'd just made the worst mistake of his life, Bumpy Johnson's war room was operating at full capacity. Theodore Green spread a series of documents across the table: property records, loan agreements, business licenses. In 1964, information wasn't digital. It required legwork, connections, and cash payments to clerks who knew how to look the other way. By midnight, Green had assembled a complete financial profile of Charles Whitfield Petton III, and what he found was beautiful. The Petton's $45 million empire was built on a foundation of debt. He had $9 million in outstanding loans from two banks, Manufacturers Hanover and Chemical Bank. His luxury buildings on the Upper West Side generated impressive revenue, but his cash flow was tight. He was, in the language of finance, over-leveraged. In other words, he was vulnerable. Bumpy studied the documents and smiled. "A house of cards," he said quietly. "We just need to blow on it." The strategy was elegant in its simplicity: attack on 4 fronts simultaneously: financial, political, social, legal. Hit him everywhere at once, so fast he wouldn't know which fire to put out first. The financial front. Tuesday morning, October 13th. Theodore Green made 3 phone calls to 3 different people. None of them worked for Bumpy Johnson directly, but all of them owed him favors, the kind of favors that don't get refused. By Tuesday afternoon, independent risk assessment consultants were providing confidential reports to loan officers at Manufacturers Hanover and Chemical Bank. The reports were professional, detailed, and devastating. They outlined a simple truth: Charles Petton was about to become a liability. Here's what the banks understood in 1964 that Petton didn't. The Civil Rights Act had changed the game. A developer with a reputation for racism wasn't just morally problematic. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, and lawsuits meant legal fees, bad press, and most importantly, risk to the bank's money. The reports also hinted, delicately, carefully, that certain loan officers might want to examine their own exposure. There were rumors, the reports suggested, about where certain bank executives spent their Friday nights. Harlem had excellent after-hours clubs, very discreet, very memorable. By Wednesday morning, both banks were reviewing Petton's loan agreements, looking for clauses that would allow them to call in the debt early. The political front, Tuesday afternoon, October 13th. Bumpy Johnson had been quietly funding civil rights organizations for years. Not publicly. A man with his background couldn't afford that kind of attention, but through intermediaries, through cash donations that never appeared on any ledger. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the NAACP had been looking for a test case, something that would demonstrate that the Civil Rights Act wasn't just words on paper, something that would show that Black Americans wouldn't tolerate discrimination, even in the most exclusive stores in Manhattan. When the story of the Bergmann and Sterling incident reached them, leaked through channels that couldn't be traced back to Bumpy, they mobilized immediately. By Tuesday evening, organizers were making calls. By Wednesday morning, protesters were gathering outside Petton's luxury apartment building, on West 86th Street. They carried signs. They sang freedom songs. They handed out flyers to every potential tenant, every current resident, every person walking by. The flyers were simple. Would you want to live in a building owned by a man who thinks the Civil Rights Act doesn't apply to him? Peyton's buildings weren't just real estate. They were luxury products sold to wealthy liberals who wanted to feel progressive. The protests turned those buildings into conflict zones. Within 48 hours, 3 prospective tenants canceled their lease agreements. 2 current tenants gave notice. Each empty apartment was $2,000 a month in lost revenue. The Social Front, Wednesday morning, October 14th. In 1964, a man's worth in Manhattan wasn't measured by his bank account alone. It was measured by his club memberships. The Knickerbocker Club, the Union Club. These were the boardrooms where real power was exercised, where deals were made over lunch, where a man's reputation was everything. Charles Patton had been a member of the Knickerbocker Club for 23 years. On Wednesday morning, the club's board received 3 phone calls from 3 different members. Old money, the kind of families that had been in New York since the Dutch, expressing concern about recent events. They didn't threaten. They didn't demand. They simply suggested that the club might want to distance itself from controversy. The board understood. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. The old ways of doing business were becoming unseemly. A man who caused public scenes, who drew attention, who made the club vulnerable to protests or bad press. That man was a liability. By Wednesday afternoon, Patton received a letter. It was polite, formal, and devastating. The club suggested that he might want to voluntarily resign his membership to pursue other interests. It was a social death sentence. The media front Wednesday afternoon, October 14th. At the New York Amsterdam News, Harlem's most influential newspaper, ran a front-page story. Businessman violates spirit of Civil Rights Act in Fifth Avenue incident. The story didn't name Peyton directly. Libel laws were strict, but it provided enough details that anyone who mattered knew exactly who they were talking about. It described the incident, quoted witnesses, and framed it as a test of whether the Civil Rights Act would be enforced not just in the South, but in the heart of liberal New York. By Thursday morning, the New York Times picked up the story. Smaller, buried on page 17, but there. Discrimination complaint filed against Upper West Side developer. Peyton's name was now in the paper of record. His reputation, the only currency that mattered in his world, was in freefall. And through it all, Bumpy Johnson sat in his office above the Palm Cafe, making phone calls, moving pieces on a chessboard that Charles Patton didn't even know he was playing on. By Wednesday evening, less than 72 hours after the incident, Patton's world was collapsing. His loans were being called, his buildings were under siege, his club had expelled him, his name was in the newspapers, and he still had no idea who was doing this to him. That was about to change. Wednesday, October 14th, 4 p.m. Theodore Green walked into Charles Patton's office building on Madison Avenue, wearing a suit that cost more than most men made in a month. He carried a leather briefcase and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from holding all the cards. Peyton's secretary tried to stop him. "Mr. Peyton isn't taking meetings today. He'll take this one," Green said calmly, and walked past her. When he opened the door to Patton's office, he found a man who looked like he'd aged 5 years in 3 days. Patton's desk was covered in papers, loan documents, legal notices, newspaper clippings. His phone had been ringing non-stop. His world was burning down, and he had no idea why. "Who the hell are you?" Peyton demanded. "My name is Theodore Green. I'm an attorney." Green sat down without being invited. "I'm here to explain what's happening to you." "I don't need—" "Your banks are calling $9 million in loans," Green interrupted. "Your buildings have protesters outside. Your club expelled you. The newspapers are writing about you. And you're sitting here wondering what you did to deserve this." Peyton's face went pale. "How do you know?" "Because I helped make it happen." The room went silent. Green opened his briefcase and pulled out a single photograph. It showed Mayme and Ruthie Johnson walking into Bergmann and Sterling. He placed it on Peyton's desk. "Monday afternoon," Green said quietly. "You humiliated 2 women in a Fifth Avenue boutique. Do you remember?" Peyton stared at the photograph. "What does that have to—" "Those women," Green continued, "were May Johnson and her daughter Ruthie. Does the name Johnson mean anything to you?" Peyton shook his head, confused. "Ellsworth Johnson," Green said, "though most people call him Bumpy." The color drained completely from Peyton's face. Even a man who lived on the Upper East Side had heard that name. Everyone in New York had heard that name. That's his wife and daughter," Green confirmed. "The family you decided to abuse in public. The family whose dignity you thought you could destroy without consequence." Peyton slumped in his chair. For the first time he understood. The protests, the banks, the club, the newspapers, none of it was random. It was coordinated, surgical, personal. "What does he want?" Peyton whispered. Green stood up, straightening his tie. "On Saturday, October 17th, Mayme and Ruthie Johnson will return to Bergmann and Sterling. They will shop for as long as they wish. They will be treated with the respect they deserve. And you will ensure that happens." "How am I supposed to—" "Figure it out," Green said coldly. "Because if they're not treated like royalty, what's happened to you this week will seem like a pleasant memory." He walked to the door, then paused. "Mr. Peyton, you thought you could humiliate a black woman because the law had just changed, and you wanted to prove it didn't matter. You were wrong. The law matters. But more importantly, she matters. Her family matters. And you just learned that the hard way." Theodore Green left Charles Peyton sitting in his ruined office, surrounded by the wreckage of his empire, finally understanding the cost of his contempt. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what happens on Saturday is the most powerful moment in this entire story. Also, what's the weather like where you are? Let me know in the comments. Saturday, October 17th, 2 p.m., Mayme and Ruthie Johnson walked through the doors of Bergmann and Sterling for the second time that week. But this time, everything was different. Mr. Carmichael, the store manager, was waiting at the entrance, but he greeted them with a bow that would have been appropriate for visiting dignitaries. "Mrs. Johnson, Miss Johnson, welcome. We are honored by your presence." The store had been transformed. Fresh flowers on every counter, the finest pieces from Paris displayed prominently, and most importantly, 3 additional staff members assigned exclusively to assist them. Outside, members of CORE and the NAACP stood in a quiet line, not protesting, observing, bearing witness. Theodore Green stood among them, arms crossed, watching through the window. Half a block away, Bub Hewlett leaned against a car, his presence a silent reminder of who had made this moment possible. Inside, May and Ruthie shopped for 2 hours. They tried on gowns. They examined jewelry. They asked questions about fabrics and designers. And every single staff member treated them with meticulous, genuine respect. The other customers, white, wealthy, uncomfortable, kept their distance, but they were polite, silent. Some even nodded in acknowledgement. Margaret Holbrook, the woman who had watched silently on Monday, approached May near the end of their visit. "Mrs. Johnson," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up. I'm sorry." May looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. When May and Ruthie finally left, carrying bags with the Bergmann Sterling logo, they walked out into the autumn sunlight as something more than customers. They walked out as victors. The Civil Rights Act had been signed 4 months earlier, but on that Saturday afternoon on Fifth Avenue, it became real. But not because of the law alone, but because someone had enforced it. Someone had made it clear that black dignity wasn't negotiable. Charles Peyton wasn't there to see it. He was in his office, meeting with bankruptcy attorneys, trying to salvage what remained of his empire. He had started the week worth $45 million. He would end it worth considerably less. The numbers tell the story of Charles Peyton's fall with brutal clarity. By February 1965, just 4 months after the Bergmann Sterling incident, Peyton had lost $34 million in asset value. The bank loans he couldn't refinance forced him to sell 3 buildings at fire sale prices. The tenants who fled his properties never returned. The business partners who once took his calls stopped answering. But the real cost wasn't financial. It was erasure. By 1966, young Charles Whitfield Peyton III was a ghost in the city his family had helped build. No club memberships, no board positions, no influence. He became the cautionary tale that other developers whispered about. The man who let his hatred cost him everything. He died in 1968, the same year as Martin Luther King Jr., in a world that had moved past his brand of open contempt, even if systemic inequality remained. Bumpy Johnson died that same year, July 7th, 1968, of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He was 62 years old. Thousands attended his funeral. To many in Harlem, he wasn't just a powerful figure. He was a protector. The Peyton incident had proven something vital, that black dignity had enforcers, and consequences were real. The story became legend in Harlem. It was whispered in barber shops, told in living rooms. They passed down as proof that in the new America, power didn't just flow one way anymore. Historians and true crime researchers later identified the Peyton case as the birth of economic retaliation, as a tool of organized resistance. Bumpy had demonstrated that in a capitalist society, the most effective way to punish a wealthy man wasn't violence. It was making his wealth a burden. The civil rights movement wasn't just about marches and legislation. It was about power dynamics, and sometimes that power came from unexpected places, from the underground economy of Harlem, from men who operated in shadows but enforced dignity in daylight. Questions remain. Who exactly were the bank officials Bumpy influenced? What leverage did he hold? The full details died with the men who orchestrated it, but the lesson survived. In 1964, A. Charles Peyton thought he could humiliate 2 black women and walk away untouched. He believed his money, his name, and his position made him invincible. He was wrong, because dignity, it turns out, is priceless, and contempt costs everything. This story proves that in 1964, change wasn't just happening in courtrooms. It was happening in the shadows, enforced by people who refused to let their families be disrespected. If this story moved you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold stories from American history, and drop a comment. What other hidden stories from the civil rights era should I cover next? The algorithm loves engagement, and your comment helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Charles Peaton thought he could throw a dress on the floor and walk away. Instead, he walked into a 72-hour war he never saw coming and lost everything. That's the cost of contempt in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem.